Yeah, sure.
Well, everyone, welcome back to a very exciting episode of the Storybox podcast. Today, my friends, I'm delighted to welcome a debut author. She's also a journalist too. Her name is Lizzie Pook. Now, for those of you that don't know who she is, she's an award-winning writer and journalist. She began her career in women's magazines covering everything from cognitive-enhancing drugs to conspiracy theorists. Oh, we're going to have so much fun today. In 2015, she moved into travel journalism, reporting for publications such as Condé Nast Traveller, Rough Guides, Lonely Planet, and the Sunday Times. Her assignments have taken her to some of the remote parts of the world. I'm jealous already. From the uninhabited east coast of Greenland in search of roaming polar bears, which is pretty cool, to the haunting mountains of the trans-Himalayas to track endangered snow leopards, which has inspired her to write Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter. I'm holding it up for people that can see the video right now. Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter. I've got the Australian version, which looks pretty damn cool. So if you are in the shops and you do see it on the shelf, I highly recommend that you go and pick it up. And why wouldn't you? I mean, it looks enticing to me, and the title looks enticing too. But it is her debut novel after spending time in northwestern Australia. So not my home part of the world, but in Australia at least, researching dangerous and fascinating the pearl diving industry. It's already out, so go and get a copy right now. But Lizzie, can I welcome you so much to the Storybox podcast today?
Hi, pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I know you're in the UK, so it's quite late for you, but the good thing is you're a night owl. I'm a morning person, so I guess it worked out.
That works out well, yeah. Perfect match.
Indeed. Well, congratulations first and foremost on writing, I guess, your debut novel. I mean, writing a book in the first place is no easy thing. There's a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of emotions that does go into it, especially even for a novel. I do want to get into it in just a moment and then unbox more of your story. But the very first question that I do have for you is a question I love asking all my guests at the very start, which is, what does success look like for you?
Oh, starting with a tough question. Do you know what? I think success for me is living a balanced and happy life where I can do what I enjoy doing without having to worry about things like financial pressures and things like that. So it's not necessarily, I'm an author and I don't necessarily see success as, being at the top of the book charts or selling X amount of books. But I think having a life where I can just write and be happy and provide for my loved ones is success to me. I think. I also think success is an ever-changing thing. I think our goalposts change constantly throughout our lives, don't they? And, perhaps if you'd asked me that 10 years ago, my answer would probably have been very different. So that's my answer today.
No, I like that answer. Was there more of a catalyst moment for you when you did realize that was success right now? Or was it, because you mentioned that it sort of changed for you over time. Why is that the case for you?
Do you know what? I actually think it's probably health. The reason one of the reasons that I made the transition from a very, very active and on-the-go career as a travel journalist to being more focused on novel writing is because I went through a period of ill health. And I was basically told that ill health was being exacerbated by stress, both mental and physical. And so I was basically forced to stop and to sort of ground myself. And when I'd been used to taking, dozens of long haul flights a year, it was a very strange place to be. It was very still and very quiet, and I didn't really know what was going to happen next. And so I started writing this book, and I never, ever sort of envisaged novel writing as a career option. I never thought that I would be able to make a living sitting, at my little desk in London and writing a book. And then, that's what I do. And I get paid to do that. And it's amazing. But now that has become part of my life. I've realized how important sort of taking care of my health is, and how important it is to have a job that means that I can do that. So I think that's where whereas perhaps when I was in my mid-20s and I was a very busy journalist working in women's magazines at that point, success would have been getting the front cover of a particular magazine or getting the best story or, just churning out the work. Whereas now it's being able to take longer, sort of a longer and more considered approach to a project. And that's really gratifying.
It's interesting, isn't it, how our health, like when we do have a crisis of health, that sort of changes our perspective on life quite a bit. I mean, it should for most people. It has for me quite a lot. Are you comfortable with sharing what the health crisis was?
Sure. So I was diagnosed with chronic illness, so an autoimmune disease. It's called ankylosing spondylitis. It's not dissimilar to something like rheumatoid arthritis. So it means that you live with sort of chronic pain and fatigue, and it can be managed, and I do take medication for it. But it can be quite an exhausting disease in that, one day you can be perfectly fine and, going on a hike for 10 miles, and then the next day you just can't get out of bed. And it's often quite difficult to pinpoint when those flares will be. And so what's been really good about being an author is that I can manage my workload around my health, which has been really, really, a really positive thing in this. So it's, taken some getting used to, but no, I'm okay. I'm fine. But it's just sort of now creating a life that has that within it. So.
Has it been hard for you to actually create the life that sort of doesn't affect the autoimmune?
It can be really hard, especially when, stress is something that, it's external factors. I don't necessarily create my own stress. So if something happens, then I will, if something negative happens, I will very possibly get ill because of the stress of it. But then also there's things like managing illness through diet and lifestyle and things like that. Sometimes that's really hard when you're just really busy and when you just, you have so many things to do and you can't think, oh gosh, should I be eating this? Should I be doing these sort of stretches? Should I be doing this sort of exercise? And sometimes you forget that you can't just do the things that you used to do, 5-10 years ago and not suffer any consequences of it. So that can be difficult too. But, there are some days when I'm perfectly fine and I don't notice it at all. And that's lovely and that's great. It's just sort of, preparing for those bad days when they come and then allowing yourself to take that rest. I've had to basically ban the word lazy from my vocabulary. I will not allow myself to think of myself as lazy or use that word, because I just don't think it should exist as a concept. If you need rest, you need rest, and your body and your brain will tell you that you need that. So it's just sort of creating the space to be able to do that.
I can understand what it's like living with autoimmune. I mean, I'm still relatively young and I found out last year that I have autoimmune in my esophagus, which kind of affects all kinds of areas with the fatigue. I get night sweats, it affects sleep. It's a horrible sort of conundrum that you got to somehow manage.
Thing, right? And we don't look ill. That's the thing. And that, with chronic illness and autoimmune conditions, certainly in the young, they're invisible illnesses. And, if, you can say to someone, I feel terrible today. They say, oh, but you look fine. I don't understand, Yep. You've got everything in place and everything seems okay. But that's why I think communication is really important as well. Like just with your other half or your family members or even your friends, and just being like, look, I'm really sorry. I'm not going to bang on about this, but there will be days where I just have to say to you, I can't make this thing that we'd agreed to do X amount of time ago. I'll make it up to you. But this is going on. So I just think talking about it is really, really good. And helps raise awareness for things like that. So
I also think as well, I'm the sort of person that doesn't like resting one bit. So I've had to sort of somehow get to that place where I have my rest days. I'm one of those people that just goes over and above. Like I'm constantly thinking, constantly doing something. Otherwise I feel like you said lazy in a way if I'm not doing something. But I'm curious, how has this whole experience, this whole health crisis affected your writing? Has it been a positive thing for your writing or a negative thing, you think?
I think it's been a positive thing. Because, writing is a very solitary pursuit, but also it's something that you can do anywhere at any time. Genuinely, all you need is a piece of paper and a pen. So whereas, if you might have an office job and you can't go into an office because you're feeling terrible, I can still sit. There have been days where I've been in my bed with like a hot water bottle on one part of my body because it's hurting, and like and a heat thing around my neck because it's hurting, but I can still be scribbling away or reading research books and stuff like that. And also, I do think that it just puts things into perspective. And that's been really helpful too, just in terms of like, it's a cliche, but trying not to sweat the small stuff. So even if it comes to being worried about how the book's received, or being worried about reviews, or being worried about sort of edits that I've just got back from my publishing team, being able to sort of keep perspective and be like, oh, do you know what? It's just words. It's just a book is actually quite positive and quite freeing, I think. And it's nice to be able to explore certain things in writing as well. Whether that's illness or whether that's grief or, what motivates you or things like that. That's been really freeing about fiction writing, because obviously as a journalist, everything that you're writing about generally is other people and things that have actually happened. Whereas with fiction, and actually I found an interesting transition from journalism into fiction. You're like, oh, you mean I have to make this up and there are no boundaries between, no constraints as to what I can write. So that's been really interesting too. But it's an ongoing relationship, sort of the balancing the chronic illness and the writing, and we'll see how it goes.
I can imagine. Well, hopefully you're not too tired and you get to receive all the praise that I have no doubt that is coming with this book. Why did you decide to go into journalism in the first place and then become a travel writer? I mean, that would be a lot of fun if you like traveling, that is.
Yeah.
In the world. But why journalism, and do you miss it today?
So basically back in the day, my first desire was to be a music journalist. I was obsessed with music and sort of going on tour and being on the road. And we've got a magazine over here called The NME, and I just would read it. I was in a band, and I was just loved that sort of idea of that lifestyle. So my very first sort of foray into journalism was writing about music and film and things like that. And then I just started becoming really interested in gonzo journalism. So journalism where people really throw themselves into the story and write about these sort of weird and unusual things. And there's a writer called John Ronson who wrote a book called The Psychopath Test and Men Who Stare at Goats and books like that. And he was just my idol, and I thought he was amazing. And Louis Theroux is another one who's, if you know of him. And I just loved that. And I thought, oh, do you know what? I'm going to be a female Louis Theroux. And that was really my ambition. And so I was really lucky to have editors who would entertain these sort of bizarre stories and allow me to go and do these things. So I think in one of my jobs, I went to India to ride motorbikes with a feminist motorcycle gang. I went to Paris to stay in a squat with a load of topless protesters in Paris. And so it was just really interesting. And I just thrived on like the weird and the wacky. And I went to brain spas to get a load of tests done on my brain and stuff like that. It's just a really, really interesting job. But hey, it's a high octane career. It's a stressful, fast paced job. You're just sort of constantly churning stuff out. And so I decided to go freelance and sort of expanded to some different stuff. And that's when I moved into the travel sphere, because I went traveling to sort of mark the difference between my staff jobs and my freelance jobs, and started writing stuff while I was on the road. And I was like, what? You're telling me that this is a job that, you can travel and write about what you've seen. And So it was a lot of graft. I basically started from the bottom up again because I'd been in women's mags or on staff, and then I was starting again as a freelance journalist in the travel sphere. And the travel sphere is really competitive. It's still quite male dominated as well. But, I just put in the work and kept pitching, kept making connections. And eventually that became my main sort of source of income. And, I was traveling around the world to these incredible places and writing about it. And looking back on it now, that seems ridiculous to me. I can't believe, especially we're still in this pandemic, but I just can't believe that was such a solid period of my life. And it was incredible. And I saw some amazing things and feel very, very privileged to have done that.
I mean, I can imagine half the things that you probably would have experienced and seen. But I want to get to some of those as well in just a moment. I promise we'll get to your book. But what did all those experiences teach you about the nature of what makes a good story compared to what makes a great story?
Oh, so interesting. Do you know what? I think it's detail. It's like the tiny little details that can really turn a good story into a great story. And I was thinking about this earlier because I was speaking to somebody about a trip that I took to Greenland, and I went on an expedition vessel to the uninhabited east coast of Greenland, which was as sort of magical as you might assume. We saw polar bears, musk oxen. We went into fjords that people hadn't been in since Inuit hunters were there hundreds of years ago. It was just insane. But what I most remember about that trip is we were off satellite signal. We had no connection to anybody for days. If something had happened to any of us on that ship, that was it. There was no way we were getting help. And we had no connection to anyone. But I remember seeing one day just sort of an aeroplane go across this big blue sky, and we hadn't seen anyone for days. And it just felt like this most bizarre sort of detail to the story, but it really sort of encapsulates how isolated we felt on that trip. So I do think it's detail. I think it's anecdotes, and I think it's speaking to the right people. Like you can just meet, I've had the privilege of meeting so many interesting people, and then also not the people that you necessarily think are going to be the most interesting. It's some of the most fascinating people I've met have been, this is an interesting job, but say bus drivers, because they see so much and they meet so many different people and they hear so many things in the back of their bus. So I think, it's all of those things, but it's a hard question.
My dad's actually a bus driver. So
amazing.
I say he's probably, he claims that he's not patient, but I mean, to be able to be a bus driver in Sydney, Australia, you've got to be.
I can imagine. Yeah, I bet he's got some good stories too.
I'm sure he does. Like I've heard some of them and I'm just going, what is going on with some people? Honestly, it just makes for a great story. What inspired you to write this particular book and set it in Western Australia? Apart, like all the places in the world you could have set it, why Western Australia?
I mean, I love Western Australia for a start. It's one of my favorite places on the planet. But the answer is that I basically happened upon a new obsession while I was in Western Australia. So I was in Broome in the northwest Kimberley, which is the most beautiful place you could possibly ever see. It's an old pearling town, and it's stunning with its bright red soil, its bright green seas. It really is a ludicrously beautiful place. But it's got this fascinating history with pearl diving. And it was during a tour at a place called Willie Creek Pearls. And they were talking to us about all the divers going down to the seabeds and contending with sharks and crocodiles and whales that would get entangled on their airlines and drag them through the water and they'd drown. And or they'd face divers paralysis, which we call the bends now. And it was just this fascinating history. And Broome itself was a tiny township, but people from all over the world descended on it like you would get with sort of a gold rush town. So in the mid 19th century, and there were people from all over the world in this really small space, rubbing up against one another. So people from America, from Asia, from Europe, from the Caribbean, and I was just hooked on this really, really interesting subject, this really interesting time, and this really interesting part of the world. And so that encouraged me to do more research, and everything that I discovered about the pearling industry, I just got sort of deeper and deeper into this obsession. And I thought, wow, okay, I need to write a book about this. But also at the time, I was reading a lot of 19th century adventure fiction. And hey, that's a really, really macho genre. There are lots of men in those books. And I thought that I needed to put a woman at the center of that sort of story. So that's how this specific book came to light. Yeah. So it's all started from there, really.
That sounds exciting. Let me come back to more of the book in just a moment, but I wanted to tie off the question about stories, because I kind of got a bit excited and wanted to jump ahead a little bit. But what do you love the most about yourself and your story?
What do I love most about myself?
Yes,
That's
and your
an
story.
Interesting question. Okay. What I like about myself is that I think I'm an empathetic person. And so I think I can see the best in people and see the different sides of lots of different stories. And what do I like best about this book? I think so basically, I wanted this book, aside from its general topic of pearl diving and that sort of history and all that interesting stuff, I also wanted it to be a book about how grief can propel us into action, and how grief can actually take us through, well, in this case, take the main character and lots of the other characters through the story and almost act as a sort of rocket fuel. So there are lots of people in this story who have suffered loss to some degree. So it might be that they've lost, they have physically lost family members, or they've lost land or liberty, because this was a time when white settlers, took from indigenous communities to a disgusting degree. But I wanted that loss to make all these characters really active, and I wanted that loss to give them agency. And that's certainly my experience of grief, and my experience of loss. I have seen it as this very propulsive thing. So that's what I think I like best about this book.
No, I like it because I think grief is an interesting phenomenon, because for some people it can propel them forward, or it can do the complete opposite. It can keep them stuck and wallowing in grief. And I'm curious, did you wrestle with that notion of, like, with my character in here, with creating her, like, I'm going to keep her in a period of being stuck before I propel her forward into this grand adventure?
Totally. And that's something that I've experienced both of those ways of coping with grief, I would say. The sort of free fall aspect of it, and then the agency aspect of it, and actually taking yourself through a story. And I did want to explore both of those things with Eliza, my main character in this book. So she is, I wanted her to be realistic. So I didn't want her to be this sort of superhero character who, yes, is, she's lost her father and that's gonna propel her through everything, because things have happened to her in the past that still hold her back and almost drag her down, like hands would drag you into an ocean. So I wanted to make that clear too. She's not okay. She is still battling with things that have happened with her past, but she is also propelled. And I think you can live those two experiences as well. And I think they can change constantly and coexist together. And that's something I wanted to explore with her.
How did you form the character of Eliza? I'm curious.
So actually, I got the inspiration for Eliza when I was in the Maritime Museum in Fremantle. So my sister and I were doing a road trip through Western Australia, and we ended up at this museum. We were like, hey, yeah, let's have a look through. And sort of tucked away among the boats and like the old anchors and things like that was an exhibition about a family of British settlers who'd sailed across to Western Australia to set up in the pearl diving industry. Yeah. The patriarch of that family was like horrible man, really quite nasty, and didn't treat his divers well. But the matriarch, the female head of the family, was pretty formidable. She was an early feminist. She set up a school in the outback. She survived storms and shipwrecks. And she had this daughter, and there was a picture of her with her daughter, and her daughter was in this white sort of christening dress and these big black heavy boots. And I was like, those two girls, women, are really interesting. And so that was the general inspiration for a sort of very strong-willed character at this time when women weren't actually given very much space or very much authority, or, you know, weren't really considered to be worth much more than being a woman, you know, the opposite to a man. So that was where I got my inspiration for her.
What does it mean for you to be creative? I'm here today with all the time.
You know, that's really,
sorry.
Yeah, you definitely are. It's interesting because I think creativity, and especially in terms of being an author, can sometimes look like writing 5,000 words a day. You know, but I don't necessarily think that's creativity. I think that's slog. And I think that's numbers. What is the best sort of creativity for me is if I've gone for, say, a really long walk, or I've gone for a swim or something, and I've come back and I've picked up a Post-it note and I've worked out how to fix a problem in my book. And that's one sentence. So I think for me, creativity is like breakthrough and progress and being propelled into something. I don't think it's necessarily sort of sitting at a desk and tapping out thousands of words a day, even though I need to do that too. But yeah, I think sometimes creativity can be sort of really small, tiny moments that actually have a big impact on sort of a general project.
So in saying that, I love that answer. Did you find yourself having a lot of creative blocks during this writing process? Yes, I would say so. But I also don't think I necessarily agree with the idea of writer's block. Yep. I think that comes from sort of being a journalist. You can't make a living with writer's block as a journalist because you have to write that article, you have to meet that deadline, you have to just get it done. So I do think I can get stuff down. You know, I think I'm always able to write something. Whether it's any good and whether it's going to end up in the final book, that's sort of up for debate. But I also do think that being active and doing activities that are quite sort of repetitive and meditative, like swimming and walking, can really help when it comes to those sort of untangling those knots that are in your brain and those plot points and things like that. So, yeah. How did you know as you were writing that this in fact was done? It was like, this chapter was finished, I'm done with this one. Like, I'm curious about this whole process of actual getting the flow right.
It's never done. It never feels done. It never felt done to me. So I was editing this book right up to, you know, the last minute. So the first draft of this book looks nothing like the final draft of this book. It was a constant redrafting process, tweaking things, fiddling with things. And then you write a manuscript then it gets turned into a printed thing, and you get to look at that before it gets turned into a final book. I was tweaking that up until the last minute. And I just think that's very common for authors. Obviously that's a difference between journalism and fiction as well. With journalism, you write something quickly, send it off into the ether, and there's sort of no real chance to panic or tinker or obsess. Whereas when you're an author, there is lots of time to sort of agonize over words and phrases and should this chapter be here? And I think it's good that there are deadlines, because I think some authors would just be sort of playing around with their books for forevermore.
I like how you said you didn't feel like it was finished, like it's never done, because I'm sort of in that process at the moment with my first book, which is coming out in September in America, which is like an exciting whirlwind. But at the same time, I'm like, yeah, it doesn't feel like it's done. And I'm like you, right? I look at the very first draft of my book and I'm like, this doesn't look anything like what it is now, and I'm still trying to change a few things. Like I'll think of something new and I'm like, oh, I've got to put that in.
I know, that's the thing.
Like, whoops, just annoy my publishers.
I just think we'll live in this constant state of feeling like it's never done, and that's just something that we're going to have to learn to live with, I guess. But yeah, it's a fun journey, isn't it? Yeah.
But what are you most proud of regarding this book, and how long did it take you to finish the book in the first place?
So the research process was quite long and spread out, because I started researching it sort of with this vague idea of a book in mind several years ago, when I was still a journalist and I was still traveling around the world. And so whenever I could, I would get research in for this thing, and I think, this is for the future book. This is for the future novel. And it was only really when I was diagnosed with the autoimmune disease that it started actually properly forming shape and becoming a routine and getting the words down. So in terms of that part of it, was probably a year and a half from sitting down and actually writing it. And did you say what am I most proud about?
What are you most proud about it?
Do you know what? I think I'm proud of being able to get across an interesting and difficult part of history, and it not feel like a textbook or a reference book. And I'm saying that because of sort of feedback that I've had from readers who have said, oh, this really drew my attention to a really interesting and fascinating part of history, but it was also a page turner, and I was also invested in the story. And I think that is a worry, when you're a journalist, especially writing in historical fiction, you perhaps worry that you're going to bog your reader down, or they're going to, there's going to be just too much information about the historical aspects of it. But in a technical sense, that's what I'm most proud of it. But I'm also just proud of getting there, getting to the end of writing a book, because when you start doing it, you feel like that's never going to happen. So
I completely understand what you mean. Sorry, my dog was barking there in the background. She's a German Shepherd puppy, so she can bark quite loud. But I completely understand what you were saying there in terms of writing, the whole writing process. It is not an easy thing. So I think you should be proud, not just coming up with the idea, but actually getting it out there into the world. And like I was saying not long ago, I think it's going to go really, really well. To me, I love page turners. I mean, I'm a creative individual just naturally, and I have a visual mind. So I love reading books that have visual appeal to them. And I think if I can picture it, then it's going to be great for me.
I have a similar brain. When I was actually writing the book, I printed out dozens of pictures of the landscape, 19th century pearl divers, women from that period that I thought looked inspiring and like badass, and just plastered them on my wall. So when I was typing, because obviously I couldn't be in Australia all the time doing all the research, when I was here in London sort of typing away, I'd be able to look at this like wall of inspiration and visualize it. And I had a Pinterest board and all those sorts of things. So I'm definitely a very visual writer too. And I'm the same. If I'm reading a book and if I really feel immersed in it and can really picture it, then that's what makes a page turner for me.
Do you have a favorite book?
Oh, do you know what? I love The Life of Pi by Jan Martel. And that was actually, I loved reading that again while writing this book. I just think it's so outlandish. It's like one of those books that's so outlandish, but he's pulled it off really well. And again, that's really immersive. And you just feel like you're there when the ship is sinking and all these animals are sort of coming out of their cages and they're in the sea. And also it's a really clever book as well. You get to the end of that book and you're like, oh God, have I just read something completely differently? There's like a big clever twist at the end. So I think that's one of my favorite books. But I read a lot of different genres. Another of my favorite books is a book called Do No Harm, which is by a brain surgeon called Henry Marsh. Yep. And it's just fascinating. He talks about the intricacies of being a brain surgeon, but also just the psychology of it and the patients and the people he meets and this heavy burden of having life in your hands as well. And so, yeah, that's one of my favorite books too, but I'm definitely flexible with genre and read all sorts of different things.
I think the Do No Harm book, that's on my list, my reading list. So I can't wait to get to it.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's so good.
I'm still working through. I've got books off to the side. You can't see them. I've got another bookshelf off to this side, and I got this one that kind of looks pretty in the back.
Yeah.
But I'll definitely finish your book, and I'll send you an email or I'll tag you in a post on Instagram and let you know what I thought of it. I have what they call a Phantom Times bestseller list. It's nothing like the New York Times or anything like that. But it's my own personal, like a friend of mine, the middle book there, Simon Hill, he kind of created it for me because I started doing like these mini book reviews. So because I'm a huge reader. So I can't wait to get stuck into this one and finish it. And which brings me to my next question, which is, where can people get a copy of the book? If they're in Australia, the UK, is it coming out in the US too?
Yes, it is. So it's out in Australia now, and you can get it online, everywhere that you get books online, and every good books shop as well. You should be able to find it. In the UK, it's coming out in March, on the 3rd of March. And then in the US and Canada, it's coming out in June. And then other territories after that. So, yeah, it's been really exciting sort of seeing how different territories have interpreted the book in terms of cover and things like that. So all the covers are very different. That's really interesting. And how they're marketed as well, like the sort of genre that it's marketed in. It's just fascinating. It's really interesting stuff, and I feel really lucky.
And where do you want people to connect with you, Lizzie?
So I do have a website that's www.lizziepook.com, but I'm on Instagram and Twitter. Both are at Lizzie Pook, and I'd love to hear from anyone. Just do get in touch, ask me anything. So
I'll make sure everyone knows where to get a copy of the book. I personally love going into like my local Dymocks or bookshop and then being able to see it on display. And I'm like, I know that person. They wrote it. I feel like a sense of accomplishment, even though I didn't write the book.
Totally, I can understand that.
It's so cool. So I can't wait to go into the local bookshop down the road from my house and see it and just sing your praises to the staff members and then everyone else
thank you.
I come into contact with. But Lizzie, I got one final question for you, if that's all right with you. This is my all-time favorite question. I love asking all my guests at the very end. If you thought all the others were hard, maybe this one might be harder. We'll see how we go.
I'm preparing myself.
But it's a hypothetical question, but I want you to imagine with me for a moment that you're being able to reach the age of 100. All your friends and your family have decided to put together a film for you of everything you've ever said and everything you've ever done. Don't ask me how in the world they got it all. We'll call it magic for the sake of argument. But they're being able to get it and show it to you on your 100th birthday. What do you want that film to say and to show about your life?
I just think it would be really nice for it to show that I always gave it a go. Like I always gave everything my best shot, and I wasn't scared of taking risks and putting myself out there, because that's something that I strive to do. It can be quite hard to put yourself out there as an author, as a journalist, as a woman in general. And so I really hope it would say that. But also, it's all about family and friends, isn't it? That's what really matters at the end of the day. So it would be nice to have a little show reel of all that, all my lovely relationships and things like that. But yeah, she gave it a go would be a good one.
I think it's a perfect send-off message for people to take away from everything that you've said. I've really enjoyed this conversation. You're a lot of fun. You're bubbly, bright, and you got some great stories. I think we could have gone a little bit longer with the other stories. I could have dug a little bit deeper, but just can I say thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and continuing to do. And what's next for you? Just real quick, I'm curious, the next book,
Yeah, so I'm writing my second book, or attempting to write my second book, which is interesting, while you're living in the world of book one and then trying to write book two. So I do have a first draft of it. So that's something. I've got something down, something to sort of chip away at and mold into something that resembles a book. But that might take some time. But yeah, that's my main focus. Every day. Well, talking about this book and trying to write the other book.
Very, very exciting. Can't wait for the second book, even though I haven't finished the first one. But anyway, thank you so much, Lizzie, for joining me today on the Storybox podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.